Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a really interesting piece that came up a recent YouTube interview with former UK Prime Minister Liz Truss.
That's right. You shared this source, and it certainly got us talking. It's packed with some, well, pretty thought-provoking perspectives on British governance, democracy.
Yeah, and the challenges facing the nation. It's quite wide-ranging.
Absolutely. So our goal here is to really dig into Truss's arguments, get to the heart of her analysis on these big issues Britain's facing.
Okay, so let's lay out what we'll cover. Based on the interview, we'll look at first the economic vision she had, when she became PM, and the opposition she says she faced.
Then we'll get into her claims about democracy in the UK, how she feels it's become less democratic, and this rise of unelected bodies.
Right, and immigration, that's a huge part of the conversation, along with related social issues. We need to spend some time there.
Definitely. We'll also touch on her ideas about, well, what some might term a deep state, or maybe more like a kind of ideological influence in key institutions.
And her views on immigration versus different economic models, her take on Tony Blair's legacy.
And finally, yeah, her own reflections on that very brief time as prime minister and her thoughts on change, who she admires, that sort of thing.
So our mission here really is to cut through the noise a bit, understand the core of what she's arguing, and give you, the listener, a clearer picture of these complexities she describes.
Exactly. It's not just what she's saying, but trying to grasp why, based on her experiences. We want to pull out the key takeaways for everyone listening.
Right, let's kick off with the economy then. Truss is, well, she's very clear her top priority as PM was reversing what she saw as long-term economic stagnation.
And her strategy. She lays it out. Tax cuts, pushing fracking, basically anything to boost economic growth.
The idea being a stronger economy funds better public services, defense, all of that.
But what's interesting is how she immediately frames the pushback.
Okay.
She talks about this powerful economic establishment.
Yeah, that's a phrase she uses quite deliberately, isn't it?
It is. And she accuses this group, people, she says, believe in higher taxes and are skeptical of the Laffer curve, that theory about tax rates and revenue.
Right. She argues they basically undermined her plans.
Yeah.
Actively worked against them.
And she does acknowledge the inflationary pressures, too, pointing to money printing after the financial crisis and during COVID.
So it's this classic clash, isn't it, between different economic philosophies. Supply side versus maybe more established interventionist views.
Absolutely. And her experience, as she tells it, highlights just how hard it is to push through major change against that kind of ingrained thinking and institutional weight.
So the takeaway here for listeners is understanding that fundamental disagreement on economics and the real-world difficulty of shifting policy. Okay, moving on to democracy. This is where she makes some pretty strong claims. She says flat out she thinks Britain has become less democratic.
That Parliament's power has diminished.
Exactly, which naturally raises questions about where power actually sits in the UK system now.
And she points fingers specifically at the growth of quangos.
Quasi-autonomous, non-governmental organizations, yeah.
She gives examples. The Bank of England, the Migration Advisory Committee, Climate Change Committee.
Saying these bodies have huge influence, but aren't directly elected.
And it's not just them. She also talks about the bureaucracy, the civil service. She mentions the Civil Service Code, how Gordon Brown's Constitutional Reform and Governance Act made it harder to challenge or fire civil servants.
So entrenching power there, in her view.
Yeah, and then there's judicial review. She seems really concerned about its expanding role.
She brings up that example of Kazan individuals using the Ukrainian scheme.
Yeah, claiming that was a judicial decision overriding what politicians might have decided.
So for her, it's a trend. Decisions moving away from elected leaders towards judges, bureaucrats, these committees.
It really makes you think about that balance of power, doesn't it? And the influence these non-elected groups have.
Let's turn now to immigration and social concerns. She says this is something the public is really worried about.
High levels of immigration, yeah. And she specifically mentions concerns around Islam and Islamism.
What's quite striking is her claim that for about a decade you couldn't really discuss these things openly.
That you'd risk being labeled racist. So legitimate concerns, she implies, got shut down.
And her view on fixing it is, well, it's radical. She doesn't think just voting differently is enough.
No, she talks about needing to reverse 40 or 50 years of law, a fundamental restructuring.
She gets specific, too, naming the Human Rights Act and the European Convention on Human Rights as things needing repeal.
And she uses that example of the child sex abuser whose deportation was stopped because of his right to family life under the Act.
It's a powerful, emotive example she uses to illustrate her point about the legal framework being flawed.
Definitely. And she also targets the Constitutional Reform Act 2005, wanting judges to be more accountable.
And that 2010 Governance Act, again, wanting the ability to appoint senior civil servants aligned with government policy, more like the U.S. system.
Which ties into her broader concern about what she calls infiltration of institutions.
Yeah, she lists specific ideologies: Islamism, environmental extremism, transgender ideology, claiming they've gained influence in the civil service.
It's quite a strong accusation.
And then, almost surprisingly, she brings up grooming gangs.
Right. Saying she was shocked it wasn't brought to her attention as PM, even though she believes the issue was known within government.
Which points to a potential breakdown in information flow, doesn't it? Even at the very top.
It really does. So the takeaway here seems to be understanding the layers, legal, institutional, that she sees complicating immigration and social policy.
This kind of leads naturally into that idea of a deep state, though she frames it a bit differently.
Yeah, she rejects the idea of some central conspiracy, like a shadowy room where everything's decided.
But she does talk about groupthink.
Exactly. Influenced by, well, a whole network.
Yeah.
The Davos elite, big corporations, government departments, the media, even the U.S. State Department she mentions.
Her argument is that Western democracies have been swayed by this elite group of technocrats.
Pushing certain agendas like net zero, transgenderism.
And she says even when she was Minister for Women and Equalities, it was hard to pinpoint who exactly was driving these things internally.
Which is interesting, isn't it? Not a secret cabal, but maybe a convergence of powerful groups and accepted ideas shaping policy almost implicitly.
Making it hard to see the strings, even from the inside. That's a key point she's making.
Definitely.
Okay, let's shift to immigration again, but specifically it's linked to economic models. She outlines what she sees as the view inside the Treasury and the Bank of England.
Right. According to her, their dominant view is that immigration is, well, basically the main way to prop up the economy.
That they're skeptical about boosting productivity from the existing workforce, or maybe downplay the negative effects of high taxes.
But she pushes back hard on that.
Yeah, she argues mass immigration actually lowers GDP per capita even if the overall GDP number goes up.
Suggesting many immigrants might be unemployed or in low-skilled jobs, not adding as much economically.
And she links this to things like the housing crisis.
Creating what she calls a vicious cycle. Immigration makes housing harder, makes it tougher for Brits to afford families, which then creates a perceived need for more immigration.
It's a bleak picture she paints. She also critiques what she calls a globalist philosophy.
The idea of prioritizing everyone equally, potentially over British citizens' specific interests. She mentions Keir Starmer's human rights lawyer background here.
And touches on cultural impacts, too, citing concerns about unfavorable views towards Jewish people in some immigrant communities.
It really shows how complex this debate is. Economics, social impact, culture, philosophy, all wrapped up together. Listeners need to weigh these different angles.
Now, Tony Blair's legacy. Truss sees his constitutional reforms as, well, game-changing, fundamentally shifting power.
Especially the Human Rights Act, creating the Supreme Court, changing how judges are appointed.
She argues these empowered the legal system significantly.
And she's critical of how the conservatives responded, suggesting David Cameron tried to kind of emulate Blair's political success.
But maybe didn't fully grasp how radical those constitutional changes really were.
That's what she implies, yeah. That the long-term consequences weren't fully understood or countered.
It raises important questions about how constitutional changes play out over time, doesn't it?
Absolutely, the long tail of those decisions.
So, given all this, what about the future? How does she see change happening? She talks about needing radical change.
Yeah, she draws parallels with Milei in Argentina, Trump in the U.S., says you need to rip things up, not just tinker.
It's interesting, she seems a bit critical of Nigel Farage's current approach, suggesting it's maybe too cautious for her liking.
Believing you need a really strong public mandate to make the kind of fundamental shifts she thinks are necessary.
She does express a hope, though, for collaboration between, as she puts it, the positive elements of the Tories and Reform UK.
But fundamentally, she keeps coming back to reversing those Blair laws, especially the Human Rights Act.
And she clearly admires figures like Trump and Milei, calls them heretics, challenging the establishment.
She even shares that anecdote about meeting Trump, finding common ground on politics, him being a big fan of Britain. And she mentions being impressed by El Salvador's Nayib Bukele, too.
It really reveals her core belief, doesn't it? that the system is so broken, only a disruptive, almost revolutionary approach will work.
Mm-hmm. Her admiration for those specific leaders really underlines that conviction.
It's fascinating then to hear her reflect on her own 49 days as PM. She talks about the excitement she felt, finally being able to implement her agenda after feeling held back before.
And despite how short it was, she still believes her mini budget was the right plan.
Yeah, she feels she was scapegoated. Points to a Bank of England report, actually, saying they were largely responsible for the market turmoil, not just her policies.
It's quite a defense. What's really striking is she says the experience made her more radical.
Seeing firsthand how broken the British state is, encountering what she calls insurmountable blocks to getting things done.
She mentions her husband's support, the surreal speed of becoming PM, and that meeting with the Queen at Balmoral.
Which turned out to be the Queen's last audience. She says she had no idea how ill the Queen was.
And just inheriting this pile of crises simultaneously, it sounds overwhelming.
She also dismisses left-wing criticism as just a sneery view trying to undermine anyone trying to fix things.
Her reflections offer this rare glimpse, don't they, into the immense pressure of that job, even briefly. And her takeaway seems to be that the problems are deeply systemic.
Towards the end, she touches on core beliefs and values, emphasizing Judeo-Christian values as society's foundation.
Though she's clear she's not advocating for, like, a theocracy or state church.
Interestingly, she's quite critical of the Church of England itself.
Yeah, and Shion says it's completely lost its way with woke stuff and anti-British sentiment in her view.
But despite all the problems she outlines, she still holds on to a belief in British greatness, its history.
And stays focused on finding solutions, maintaining a positive outlook, surprisingly perhaps.
Yeah, it really highlights her underlying values: tradition, national pride, and this persistent, maybe defiant optimism.
Exactly.
Okay, so to wrap up this deep dive, wow, we've covered a lot. Truss's economic and political analysis, her worries about democracy and unelected power, her strong views on immigration, the groupthink idea, her own PM experience.
It's a comprehensive critique she offers. For me, I think the scale of the legal and institutional barriers she describes, and that point about information potentially not reaching the top, those were particularly striking takeaways.
Yeah. Hopefully for everyone listening, this has given you a solid, digestible overview of her perspective straight from the source material.
Which leads us to a final thought for you to consider. Based on Truss's analysis, what do you think is the most critical structural issue facing the UK right now? And what kind of change, if any, is really needed to tackle it?
Definitely something to mull over. Thank you so much for sharing the interview source with us, and thanks everyone for joining us on this deep dive.